Hello, hi everyone. Welcome back to Woo Can Cook. My name is Wesley, and this is a show where we are slowly cooking our way through all of the food from my childhood. Today we're diving back into our series dedicated to Chinese comfort food classics with a shot at a Chinese Zha Jiang Mian, which literally translates to fried sauce noodles, which, as is often the case with Chinese dishes, just the most useless and worst description ever. So, for those who are unfamiliar, Chinese Zha Jiang Mian is a meat sauce-based noodle dish done with thick, round, lo mein noodles, ground pork, and any number of veggies depending on who's cooking it, what region of the world you're in, and whatever happens to really be in season. Today we're going to be doing ours with a fairly classic combination of zucchini, sweet white onion, and cucumber, but other common classic additions might also include things like edamame, carrots, bean sprouts, eggplants, and many more, so get creative and use your imagination for your own attempts. Most iconically though, a Chinese Zha Jiang Mian must include two very important ingredients, the first being fermented black soybean sauce or dough-chirr, which will form the basis of our sauce today, and the second being a smoked and pressed firm tofu to round out our proteins. It's also worth mentioning that although today we are specifically taking a look at the Chinese Zha Jiang Mian, you will also find that this dish appears across many different food cultures in similar iterations. It is, after all, not a very complicated concept, so not surprisingly, it appears all throughout Asian cuisine as well. Okay, so let's get into it. Okay, so kicking things off here, we're starting out with our aromatic elements that you'll see come up in most of our savory Chinese dishes for their fundamental umami qualities. This is 4 cloves of crushed and minced garlic, followed by 1 inch or about 1 tablespoon of finely minced ginger. Next up, I'm moving on to our veggies here. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is the element that you'll likely see varying pretty widely depending on who's making the dish. But again, any kind of durable veggie that can withstand aggressive wok heat will serve well. I know my dad used to make this dish with edamame and I think bell pepper, which I never liked. But anyway, this is 2 small zucchinis that I'm large dicing and setting aside, followed by half of a medium white onion that I'm similarly large dicing as well. Then last up, rounding out our veggies, is some cucumber, which I'm gonna julienne cut for our garnish. I'm doing this by first slicing up my cucumbers into quarters to remove their seeds before we go for our julienne. These seeds contain a lot of water, so if we try and chop them up with our julienne, they're just gonna turn into mush, which is not very useful. Next up, moving on to our proteins. Now, as some folks who have been following the live streams know, I've been tweaking this dish for quite some time. We cook this dish on live stream every month or so because it's one of my favorite noodle dishes, and we even did a recipe for a slightly more Americanized version using bacon a while back as well. But I think the thing that has been missing this entire time from all of our previous attempts is this firm pressed smoked tofu, which we're gonna small dice. You might also see this stuff labeled as marinated tofu, pressed tofu, or tofu bacon. That's kind of a weird one. But what's important to know is that nearly all of the liquid has been pressed out of this stuff and then it's been smoked, which gives it a super dense and fragrant quality. You can find this in most Chinese grocery stores and even some American ones that carry meat substitutes as well. It should be fairly dense and vacuum packed, not stored in water like most firm tofu is, and should also have this brown layer on top as well. Last up, rounding out our proteins, this is half a pound of ground pork, which is going to be the most common ground meat that you'll find in a Chinese Zha Jiang Mian because pork is in pretty much all of Chinese food for no real good reason. So I know my grandmother is rolling over in her grave, but 80-20 ground beef chuck, ground turkey, and ground chicken all have worked fine for me. We're marinating this with a super simple marinade of 4 tablespoons of soy sauce, 1 teaspoon of white pepper, and half a teaspoon of cornstarch, and then mixing this all to combine and setting aside for 30 minutes or up to 1 hour. Moving on to my sauce element next, the fundamental ingredient to any Chinese Zha Jiang Mian is the fermented black soybean sauce or dough-chirr, so pretty much everything else that we add here is going to be in service of that bean sauce today. Kicking things off here first is 4 tablespoons of soy sauce and a single tablespoon of rice vinegar for some brightness. Then next is a single tablespoon of doubanjiang chili paste for some heat, followed finally by our big umami drivers for today. This is 2 tablespoons of oyster sauce and what ended up being 3 tablespoons of black bean sauce to round it all out. Now, I've mentioned this many times before, and we've even gone into a bit more detail about black bean sauce in our pantry basics video as well for those who are interested. But one more reminder that black bean sauce is very concentrated, so go easy on this stuff and adjust to taste, or you can very quickly ruin an entire dish by adding too much of it. Last up, rounding this all out, is 2 tablespoons of cornstarch that I'm dissolving in water for our cornstarch slurry, and then we're heading over to the stove. Over on the stove, I'm getting started on my noodles here. We're using some fresh round lo mein noodles today, about a pound's worth. These fresh noodles are going to be very delicate, just like any other fresh pasta, so we want our full attention devoted to our noodles right now. These are gonna cook on a boiling pot of water for 2 minutes exactly, and yes, I do mean exactly 2 minutes, not 2.5, not 3 minutes. 2 minutes later, I'm straining my noodles and then immediately dropping them into an ice bath to prevent carryover cook. A Chinese jajangmyeon is iconically plated with the sauce sitting on top of the unmixed noodles, unlike a chow mein, for example, where you might see the noodles wok tossed and fried along with the sauce. So we're setting these aside until we're ready to plate, and then heading back over to the stove to get started on our veggies next. Back over on the stove, I've got my wok heating up as hot as possible, and then I'm adding 4 tablespoons of peanut oil and, as always, long yao for that nice non-stick surface. Then going in here first is my zucchini, which is by far our most dense veggie, so I'm giving these a solid 4-minute head start to really cook off some rawness before we add in our onions. Then I'm giving this a quick 1-minute toss to combine before adding in my tofu here. There's not really much that's gonna happen to our tofu here since it's already pressed, dried, and smoked, so I'm really just tossing things to combine here before removing everything from the wok so that we may employ some batch cooking technique. I'm letting the wok reheat again as hot as possible, and then adding another 4 tablespoons of peanut oil and doing 1 more long yao. Then going in here first are my aromatic garlic and ginger elements, which I'm tossing for 15 seconds until nice and fragrant, followed immediately by my ground pork. Then I'm giving this a toss with my spatula to break up any errant large clumps hanging around, and letting this go for about 3 minutes until nice and browned. Then next up, here's my veggies going back into the wok, followed by my sauce element plus a 1/4 cup of water to help loosen things up. Here's that 3rd tablespoon of black bean sauce that I mentioned earlier. Once again, a reminder to adjust to taste with concentrated ingredients like black bean sauce. Then last up, here's my cornstarch slurry going in to help our sauce thicken up a bit before we remove this all from heat. Back over on the cutting board, here's that iconic plating that I mentioned earlier. This is my noodles going into the bowl first. I know that this looks naked, but think of it like a stir fry over rice. Then next, here's a healthy serving of my sauce, followed by our julienne cucumber, and we're ready to eat. Alright, so again, I mentioned this before, but this is one of my all-time favorite noodle dishes, and I know I've been tweaking this recipe on livestream for quite some time too, so I was already primed to be pretty stoked about this recipe from the start. But there has always been something that just wasn't quite there yet with every other time that I've made this dish, and I think what's been missing is this smoke-pressed tofu. There's just something about the texture of that pressed tofu combined with its aromatic qualities that's just really iconic and defining for me, and has been missing in every other iteration of this dish that I have ever attempted. Maybe it's because my dad uses this stuff in his jajangmyeon, or maybe it's because it really is a central ingredient in northern China-inspired jajangmyeon, but I gotta tell you that this is the thing that's been missing, and I finally figured that shit out. But anyway, as expected, those oyster and black bean sauces are both huge umami drivers in our sauce and really bring everything to life. Then that single tablespoon of doubanjiang gives us a very slight but still very present bit of heat, combining for a wonderfully rich and well-rounded sauce to complement our fresh lo mein. Lastly, I know it might seem like it's just an afterthought, but our cucumber garnish is actually pretty critical here because the fresh and crisp quality of it helps to cut through the richness of that black bean sauce in a way that I don't think would work quite as well if we used something simpler like cilantro or green onion. Okay, so that's it everyone. I hope you enjoyed this and I hope you give this one a shot. For those who are new to the channel, this one is part of a larger series that we've been doing that's dedicated to classic Chinese comfort food dishes, so definitely check out that series next if you haven't yet because there's a lot of these. For the Bay Area locals, the Wu Can Cook Fried Rice pop-up is back at Federation Brewing every Friday, so come by and say hi if you can. More about that at wucancook.com/eats. As always, like, comment, subscribe, share, be nice humans, and I'll see you soon. Bye.
We